Welcome to another conversation with Joe Reagan. And Joe, I'm not as jazzed as I was last time, but I'm still jazzed because I have some questions to ask our illustrious Congressman Jeff Crank. But I think we got this thing going on with Hegseth and Telegram, and what the hell is going on here from your point of view?
I vaguely remember there was an instance a while back. It was you and I think John Foley was on with us, and I can't remember what we were talking about, but it was another one of these Intel link or Intel leak type stories that we were discussing, and uh, both John and I have spent time in the intelligence community, and of course, I spent a couple of years as an intelligence officer, both in uniform and out of uniform. And there's so let's first give credit to the Atlantic for not publishing the entirety of the signal thread that the editor from the Atlantic was brought on there.
Yeah,
And that speaks volumes to the level of detail that must have been in this.
I
He
think we better mention it's Jeff Goldberg. If
Thank you.
I'm
Yes, yes. And the details that he's provided so far. Now, this is 100% my reading into it, but he uses the phrase sources and methods.
right.
And this is a particularly, and I always say, right? So one thing that I kind of agree with, so let's start that way, right? So with the Trump administration, one area that I actually agree with the Trump administration on is this push towards more transparency. And in the intelligence community, there is a very bad habit of overclassifying information. At the end of the day, a lot of things that work their way into classified channels are information that you could glean from reading the New York Times or the BBC or any other news agency. And but when we talk about sources and methods, we're talking what that means is we're talking about very, very specific information. And so think of those spy novels where we sit there and say, wow, I can't believe they did that. And I'm thinking in particular, just to kind of give an example of this, it's an old James Bond movie, and I can't remember which one it is, but they're in Venice, and they take a boat underneath the buildings and through like this canal, and they have set up a periscope that goes up through the building, and they're essentially looking into, I believe it's like a Russian or Soviet embassy. All right, that's the sort of very specific information that sources and methods is meant to protect, right? We don't want people to know how we get the really detailed information. And so the information that the Atlantic has disclosed had said that essentially, hey, this text thread included times, targets, so the people that were going to be targeted in this particular raid, as well as the exact timing on it. And that, to me, says that there was a potential to risk human sources. So these are the people that are out there that are providing the United States with information about our adversaries. And again, go back to read Cold War history, the spycraft stories, all those things that we now learn about what that actually looked like to be in Germany back in the 1960s, 70s, and even the 80s, and what that environment was like, where people are providing information that they should not be providing, and if they get caught, that is essentially a death sentence for them. And so that's why we really protect that level of information as that we do. And then generally speaking goes beyond just top secret information, but it's heavily compartmentalized. So the only people that are in that specific program would have access to that sort of thing. So in terms of, are we being responsible stewards of classified information, because people say, well, that's illegal, that's this. And that's not entirely true, because there's actually a great deal of leeway that you have in how you handle classified information. The law, there's not a whole lot of law behind it. There's a lot of policies and procedures, but really the law says that we just have to be good stewards of that information. We have to be responsible for it. And I would say that mistakenly adding a reporter onto a text thread is certainly not being a good steward nor responsible information. And obviously, because this is a non-government platform, a number of people are showing concern of the fact that this was not a secure means of sharing this information either. But another level of this that hasn't been getting much attention is that signal threads are deleted. And that is a violation of federal law, because there are federal laws that require official communications to be retained for a set period of time. Generally speaking, it's 50 years, and then it has to be reviewed, and then it goes back and forth, stuff like that.
Well, is that the Presidential Records Act that you're
It
referring
goes
to?
beyond that. So any federal agency is required. That's why when we have Freedom of Information Acts, you can go back a great deal of time. I mean, look at, again, the Trump administration released a great deal of information around the Kennedy assassination, which is now 60, almost 70 years ago. So, these records are retained, and that is part of the presidential library system. The National Archives maintain all of these records so that we know what's going on, so that we can go back and we can study and we can have this historical data. And a lot of it does come down to accountability, right? We need to retain information, even if it's classified, so that that information can be reviewed from time to time to make sure that we're doing the right things. And so it's particularly concerning for a lot of folks that haven't, and again, this conversation is kind of not really being had, is that if it's in a signal thread, there is no mechanism for that information to be retained. So this conversation is now no longer accessible in the public domain, ever, right? Even the Kennedy documents, even though they were classified, now, all these years later, having reviewed them, then that information has now been made public, and it's been gradual over time. And again, if you look at the information that's being released in any of these, a lot of it comes down to, hey, we don't want to put this person's name out there in the record because this person shared information with us way back when. And once that person passes away, we'll say, well, now there's no risk to that person, so we can share that name. And I'm not thinking of any specifics because I don't have a whole lot of time on my hands. And so going back to look at the Kennedy assassination has not been necessarily my top priority. But I think it's a good example of how this information is stored, why it's important to be stored, and why it's kept classified for so long. And I think that that's what we're getting at is when we talk about this signal thread, it's grossly irresponsible in the fact that when you look at the participants, all of those individuals, even the reporter knew that this information should not be shared on a signal thread. And then at the same time, it is that maintaining of government records. Official communication needs to be held. And we have staffs that do that. The national security staff, the Pentagon, have teams that travel with the agency heads to make sure that they have access to secure communications at all times. Even when they're on vacation, they still have the dude with the suitcase that's walking behind them, making sure that they have access to, that national security infrastructure to communicate with other key leaders. That's been an important part of our system, really going back to what that would have been probably the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s when we started implementing that.
That's history for you, right?
It is, yes. But it's important history, and this is stuff that is still taught today within the intelligence community. We still talk about a lot of these cases. We still talk about a lot of espionage cases in the United States. So when you go back and if you go to the Spy Museum in Washington, these are cases that, even though there's a public record, like the Rosenbergs, this is information that has been now public domain because it went through the court system. But this is still taught to young intelligence officers as, hey, these are the things that you should be looking for. This is not how you you treat classified information. This is how adversaries try to collect information on us. And so you could go back and say, well, because Signal is not a government system. I mean, I use Signal, but more just because but again, it's for private communication. I have no trust in the system that it's going to prevent the Russians from getting into whatever I'm trying to share.
Isn't it Telegram?
I thought it was Signal. Any one of these, right? Signal,
Yeah,
Telegram,
yeah,
WhatsApp, all of
yeah.
these. There's a number of commercial platforms that are out there, and like some of them have direct ties back to Russian and Chinese companies, and so it is important when you look at these things to understand, who owns this? Where does where do these servers lie? What is the privacy component to it? And if you're sharing personal information like vacations and where the kids are going, that might be one level. It makes you feel a little more secure that your neighbor can't be spying on what you're doing with your kids that weekend. But on the other end of that, we have these systems to communicate classified information, and we don't need commercial platforms to do that.
Well, former Ambassador Susan Rice tonight mentioned quite a bit of what you were saying, especially with the entourage traveling with the ambassador or the cabinet member, whatever they happen to be. And the one question that comes up to my mind is Tulsi Gabbard was out of the country, but she would not admit where, and she would not admit that she was using her own phone. And Waltz was in Moscow. I mean, hold it, guys. And you're having this conversation, text or whatever you want to call it, over a system that is not encrypted. So,
And if it's a personal cell phone too, it's using, and this is an assumption on my part, but we can assume that that is working off of domestic infrastructure for
right.
whatever country you're in. So if you're in a foreign country, and
You're,
again,
you,
as a business person,
mhm.
having traveled to China, the briefing that we got from the company was, hey, anything that's on a Chinese network is monitored. And like I would try and email home to talk to the kids, and my communications would cut. Like I mentioned something about Taiwan, and the line cut because you can't talk about the three T's in China, and the moment you mentioned any one of them, the line cuts out. It was incredible, and I had never seen something like that before. To really be sitting there and talking through a Google Meet with my kids and talking about how, I went to Tiananmen Square today, and then boom, line dead. What?
Oh,
So,
well.
but
What? Go
this is
ahead.
this is just it, right? So you go back to the first Trump administration, and he surrounded himself with, most people would argue that the original Trump cabinet was made up of pretty competent people. You might
Mhm.
not agree with how they view policy, but they seem to be competent. And Mathis is a great example. Like he was an extraordinarily competent Secretary of Defense, and then of course was fired because he had the audacity to say, maybe we should think differently about this, sir.
Yeah.
But that is the loyalist mentality that the new Trump circle has around them. Of it has nothing to do with loyalty to the Constitution. It's loyalty to Donald Trump. And now, and this is, I'll tell you, the thing that really, the Signal thing is kind of like that. It's a story. It's a crisis. It's bad. But what was truly shocking today is the Speaker of the House talking about cutting funds to the court system because the courts are pushing back. Is, well, Congress, we control funding to the courts. So if we have judges that don't want to go along, we can just cut the funding. That's the Speaker of the House, and I think that that is more than anything should be that this goes well beyond the incompetence of talking about national security on a commercial platform. That is blatant we just want to break down the system, and anyone that disagrees with us, we're just going to get rid of.
Well,
And that is, I'm sorry, that is a violation of so many different constitutional principles, and I understand it, right? So you go back and say, well, the Constitution says the Supreme Court exists, and then the Congress can set up other courts. But this is something that we haven't seen Congress intervene in the court system since it's been over 100 years. It was 1913. And that was less to do with political dispute and more it was just a restructuring of we don't need commerce courts anymore. We're going to put that into the appeals system. And so they redistributed it that way because we were just handling the way we do commerce differently. So it's those types of things that are truly alarming. And so go back to this information that's transferred on Signal is not retained. Why don't you want information retained about what you're talking about? Because you don't want someone coming back and asking questions.
well, speaking of loyalists, our illustrious Congressman Jeff Crank just got his email today, and he's defending the indefensible and Medicaid cuts, etc. My question to him, and I hope maybe you could shed a little light on this, why haven't we heard from Jeff Crank regarding this issue with the telegram issue? And also, why isn't he standing up and saying to the Speaker of the House, no, 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 we don't want to cut the courts? But he's not. So, Joe, if you were sitting in his place, how would you handle it? What would you do? I mean, obviously, Jeff is not interested in communicating with us about that. So,
And I will say that you did see on Capitol Hill Senator Warner and a few other House members. I mean, call these folks on the carpet pretty quickly. So
right.
to see these folks be called in front of Congress quickly is certainly something that is good to see. And if I were Jeff Crank, who sits on the Armed Services Committee, and if I'm elected, when I'm elected in 2026, then I also would want to seek service on the Armed Forces Committee, Armed Services Committee, because of the amount of defense work that we have here in the district. That would be an immediate, you know,
Yeah.
call them on the carpet and say, wait a second, we give you funding for secure communications. What are you doing? And the impeachment question has come up several times in regards to the president. And I think that we also we can't overlook the fact that secretaries can also be impeached. And you look at this and say, the couple swing votes that do exist, Republican swing votes that do exist on the Senate side, of Senator Collins, Senator Ernst, these are folks that ultimately voted to put Hegseth in power. And certainly if I were in Congress right now, I would be talking to my Senate colleagues to put that pressure on some of those Republican senators to say, you can come up with whatever excuse you wanted to vote for him in the first place, but this does not show a level of competence that we need for someone that is the Secretary of Defense or the Director of National Intelligence, for that matter. I mean, if anyone, Tulsi Gabbard worked as an intelligence officer. She's had the same training that I've had, and I know that she knows that was wrong. So where this fundamental lapse of judgment, which is not just limited to one person. I mean, this is a group of some of the most important, most influential decision makers in our government. And this is their decision making. So yeah, these folks are getting called on the carpet, and especially, again, putting a lot of pressure on our Senate colleagues to exercise their ability to provide that advice and consent to the president. And I think that there should be calls for resignations. There should be calls for accountability. There should be investigations, but of course we fired all of the inspectors general. Um, but this is exactly the sort of thing that uh, you know. But Crank isn't really interested in accountability. That's if you listen to him throughout the debates over the past year, accountability is not something that he's truly interested in pursuing.
Well,
It is ideological purity, and that's where you see very few Republicans willing to break ranks. And I'm not going to lie, right? And I have this conversation a lot of times. People say, "Oh, well, Democrats this, Democrats that, Republicans this, Republicans." Listen, if you think a party fully represents what you stand for, like that's a problem. Like I don't think I could say I 100% agree with anyone in this world. I'm not going to fight them over it. There might be a nuance to it, but there's got to be a level of independent thinking that exists. And Jeff Crank continues to blindly go along with the Trump agenda, which, and it's funny, I've had a lot of these conversations over the past couple of weeks where folks are like, I voted for you. I really think you could have done this. I really think you could have done that. And I'm like, well, Dave Williams seemed like a useful foil for someone like me to be like, hey, this guy is so off the rails, take a chance on me. And what I kept saying is, well, Jeff Crank and Dave Williams, there's not a lot of space between those two. Jeff Crank's just really quiet about it. He doesn't talk about it. And he is a very effective non-communicator.
well, when I read his emails and click on the links where he's speaking about something, especially this time, he was talking about the committee to natural
Resources Committee.
Natural Resources Committee. Mm-hmm. I get them confused. And he was talking about, the headline was, how important that is to the state of Colorado. Well, I sat there and watched the link of him, and he is saying absolutely nothing of any importance that would make me to want to, delve in deeper and find out more. And it seems with his photo ops and everything else, it's like he is continually auditioning for the job and with no information. And I find it frustrating. Well, he doesn't stand up.
Well, I work for a nonprofit, and I try really hard not to mix the two, right? I'm very passionate about the work I do for my nonprofit. I think it's important work. It has me out there in the community. It has me engaged. And I really try and separate the two because I wouldn't want my political aspirations to get in the way of the amazing work that my colleagues and I do in the nonprofit space. But if you follow what I'm doing out there, I was out in Eagle County a few weeks ago. And one thing that was interesting is they're really having a crisis in employment because the oil and gas industry out there are laying off workers left and right. And we sit there and say, well, we've got new permits. We've done this. We've got all this land is now open for drilling. And guess what's not happening? Nobody's drilling. And
why?
Thank you for asking. The economics of oil are fascinating. Have you ever heard of OPEC?
Let's see. OPEC, 1973, just basically threw a monkey wrench into the world economy.
Yeah.
Is that the same OPEC?
It is. And do you know who are the main players within OPEC?
You're not talking about Amoco.
Well, the nation, the Saudis, the Saudis, it's the Saudis and the Russians are right. the big players in that. And this is where it gets really fast. So to some extent, you could say, well, this is actually really smart on behalf of groups like the Saudis. And I'm going to use round numbers because I've seen these figures in the past. They do shift. But in general, to get a barrel of oil out of a Saudi well
Hmm.
costs about 25 to $30.
No.
Yeah, that's the cost. So if oil is above $30 a barrel, generally speaking, the Saudis are able to make a profit on the oil. So
Hmm.
at the end of the day, right, if you're not going to make profit on the oil, you're not going to pump it, right? That's what they do. OPEC adjusts the supply to make sure that cost stays within a range. By chance, Gary, do you know how much it costs for a U.S. well to pump out a barrel of oil?
No, I don't, but I think West Texas crude last time looked at it was like $63, $65 a barrel.
Yeah, so the profitability on that, if I remember correctly, and again, I'm using round numbers, but it's somewhere around $50.
Okay.
So the Saudis have to find this balance, and it's the Saudis and the Russians, really the OPEC nations, have to find this balance of they want to keep oil prices at a certain level so that it's not profitable for U.S. drillers to drill. And
Okay.
so you are seeing these land rights bought up, but because nobody's pushing back on OPEC, the price isn't necessarily profitable for these folks to go out and start new wells. And because of the fluctuations in the market, the risk that is there as well that has really discouraged any actual new drilling. So there's all
Hmm.
this, and this is the same thing that happens with coal, right? Oh, we need more coal. We need more. Well, go to West Virginia. Have you seen a new coal miner in 20 years? No. They're not mining more coal in West Virginia. It's not happening because it's not profitable. The market is shifting. And so you have these people that say, oh, well, we're going to support coal because West Virginia, and West Virginia has it's built into their culture, right? So they feel like this is the right thing to do. And I
Hmm.
dealt with this in Maine too. In Maine, it's always, oh, we're going to bring the mills back, the paper mills. And it's like,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, folks, the paper mills left 50 years ago, and they're not coming back.
Yeah.
And it's a shift in the way the market is moving. And so for the environmentalists, right, economics is actually supporting this push towards the clean energy market. But in terms of local markets, these policies they sound good, but when
Hmm.
you go if you actually spent 10 minutes to go out and talk to somebody in Eagle County, you realize these are all empty words. Like you said, they're photo ops with nothing behind them.
Right.
And that is Republican politics 101 of let's say things that sound great but are absolutely meaningless. And that's just it. And whether it's any number of the issues that we've talked about, when you watch what Jeff Crank says on television, on debate stage, whatever, there's literally nothing behind it. And then their actions are the exact opposite. And the action, I mean, at least he was honest with, I want to go to Congress and get rid of the Department of Education and screw special needs children. At least he
I,
was honest with that one. I
I,
mean, that
I,
credit to him. You owned it, man. Good job.
well, he had that in his email,
Yeah, he did.
getting rid of the Department of Education. And he said, we have to return everything back to the states for on the parents and everything else. And I'm saying, horse pucky. The state already takes care of the curriculum and everything else, and the parents are sticking their noses into
Mhm.
their kids' education, which, in my humble opinion, shouldn't be there. Because I look at it this way I go back to World War II. All the engineering feats that happened during World War II was public education at the local level,
Mhm.
public universities, and things were built with slide rules, French curves, T squares, paper, and pencil. And there was no computers. There was no smartphones. There was nothing. Yet they pulled stuff out of the air and made it work.
Mhm.
So I'm just a public education advocate and say, let's get back to education. Let's get back to the education of children. Let's get back to the business of educating
Mhm.
and get out of the education business.
And I just glanced over at the clock too, and I know we try and keep these at 30 minutes. And we could have a whole other one on this, but one thing, you go talk about going back to the states. And I
Right.
think that look at the numbers on that.
Yeah.
So people always say, oh, the United States were 22nd or something like that in education by whatever weird metric we're using today.
Yeah.
As a nation, yes. Compare the states to countries, right? So if you look at like the top states, South Korea, Denmark, Netherlands, a couple other of those, Finland, and those are nations that are smaller than a lot of our states. Then turn around and look at the top performing states in the U.S. and how they compare to those nations, and suddenly Massachusetts, New York, Vermont, California,
Yeah.
Colorado ranks up there pretty high, is very competitive with these others. And then you got good old Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia that just drag it down. And and there's a lot of figures behind that. You could go into statistics about where federal funding goes, right? At the same time, those are the same states that receive less federal funding than they do contribute in federal taxes. So those are they're the net losers when it comes to they're paying more into federal coffers and getting less. And meanwhile, you have states and they are generally red states, that get more in federal funding than they actually pay into the system. And that's, if you really want to throw a lot of these things to the states, I don't know if you saw it today, we're getting rid of FEMA because we should give FEMA back to the states.
FEMA was never in the states.
Well, and you know who's going to learn that the hard way?
The states.
Alabama, Mississippi. And Florida.
Yeah.
Right? Florida is running into a huge crisis, and we should. And honestly, I'm mildly sympathetic to the people of Florida. Right? You look at it, and you have what the highest point in Florida is like 365 feet above sea level, and so you're sitting there, and you're like, you have all this real estate that's built up on storm surge lanes, and it's like it's just.
Oh, yeah.
Every time we every year, how many billions of dollars of property are getting destroyed? And we do have to have a conversation. Like there needs to be a conversation around that. But
Well, just kind of wrapping it up here. The meeting we were at on Saturday with Senators Mark Schneider and Jeff Bridges, who is the head of the Joint Budget Committee chair, talking about education.
Yep.
And I was talking to Jeff, and he said that they're just going to have to do more cuts in education. So with the end of the Department of Education and the funding coming out of it, the people of Colorado especially, and the Congressional 5th District are going to have to dig deep in their pockets to keep this educational system even functioning.
Yep.
So,
and more than ever, that's the need to, right? And the charter school thing is a challenging. It's not an easy question, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure that funding stays in the public schools.
yes.
Because at the end of the day, the kids that are hurt, and remember, think back to my experience working with Easter Seals, with children with, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, all sorts. And these are kids that are on the individual education plans, the IEPs. That's a federal requirement. And if our public schools are losing that funding out to charter schools that don't have to make those accommodations, that's a loss for everybody.
Yeah.
And so there's real consequences whether you agree with getting rid of the Department of Education or not. There are consequences that are going to come down. They are coming fast, and it is going to be painful for every community in this country.
The downstream impact is going to be, I don't think there's a word for it as far as the pain level goes. So, okay,
Well,
Joe.
I'm excited this week. So I think I've mentioned before, I'm part of the Colorado Springs Rotary Club, and this week we're actually going out and we're going to be recognizing some amazing teachers in our community, and I'm really excited to do it. So hopefully, if you see me this week, I might be coming into your classroom to congratulate you for being one of the best teachers in our community.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Another episode of Conversations with Joe Reagan. Thank you so very much for listening. See you next time.